Welcome to the CPRE Knowledge Hub series on educational labor markets, the problems, mechanisms, and solutions. I'm Peter Goff, a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and today I'm joined by a panel from South Dakota.
Hello, I'm Kelly Duncan. I've been a board member of the South Dakota Board of Education for the last 19 years, and I also serve as a Dean of Education at one of our state institutions.
Hi, I'm Senator Deb Soholt, and I represent District 14 in South Dakota, which is in Sioux Falls in the southeastern part of the city. I'm also chair of the Senate Education Committee, and as we are a citizen legislature, I am a registered nurse and also have a full-time position as the Director of Women's Health within a large health system in South Dakota.
Hi there, I'm Melody Schopp. I'm the Secretary of Education for the state of South Dakota. I'm appointed by my governor and have served in this role for the past 6 years.
Thank you all for joining us. We've been talking to a lot of folks across the nation about teacher shortages, teacher labor supply in general. One of the challenges that we found is that differing availability in data has led people to characterize their shortages or not in different ways. And the data varies quite widely. And I imagine each of you have a different view on the data that you have and how the insights that it gives you into the extent of the shortage within your state. Could you share with us a little bit about the data that you're using to determine the extent of the shortage in South Dakota?
There is a lot of data that we collect in the Department of Education that's specific to our teacher demographics, as well as we have a longitudinal set of data that shows us why teachers leave the field, what the reasons are, and that gives us some sort of sense of that information. So over the past year, as we were entering into the legislative session to talk about this issue specifically, we dove into that even deeper to really look at the issue more systemically, because we know that a lot of the information that we are provided from the state and the stakeholders was a lot of anecdotal data. And so that report and that information that we were able to glean from our personnel record form system was extremely critical as we were looking at and trying to determine, was the shortage only in certain content areas, was it geographic, but more so the most important question I think that we need to ask is, what will the outcome be in a number of years specific to that shortage?
Deb, what were you hearing in the Senate?
So in 2015, our governor appointed a Blue Ribbon Task Force to really do a meaningful deep dive into, do we have a teacher shortage and what do we need to do about it? And how do we move forward from a policy perspective in the state of South Dakota? Because we were consistently hearing that we're not going to have enough teachers to manage what's happening in the student pipeline. So we hosted over 18 public forums along with various stakeholder groups and developed a qualitative report. So qualitative, concrete data, what we called the good, the bad, the ugly. And we were asking about what possibilities exist to meaningfully fund education for our kids and for our communities. And what we found out is that people wanted something done. They didn't want us just to talk about it anymore. They wanted actually some meaningful action. And that they felt that there needed to be ongoing sustainable funding. And then that we wanted to have benchmark quality within how our children were being educated.
Peter, if I may add to something that I think really helped to exaggerate the concerns in the state, was not just the shortage issue, but we were 51st in the nation for teacher salaries. So when we talk about the emotion that surrounded this, it gave even more reason for us to move aggressively forward in really diving into this issue.
Kelly, what did you see in your conversations with at the State Board of Ed in terms of the evidence being used and how that was talked about with respect to the teacher shortage?
As that information was shared with us as a state board for a long period of time, it's something that as a board we've been very concerned about. Not only concerned about the shortage of people going into education, but certainly the number of people that we were losing after the first, say, 3 to 5 year period. So as that information was shared with us, we continued to have conversations around it and knew that something probably needed to be done in the state. In my role as a Dean of Education, too, we were really noticing that geographically, especially in a lot of our rural schools, that was where the highest need was. And so we knew that was going to continue. The shortage was huge in the secondary areas and especially in our high need secondary areas such as math, science, language arts, world languages. So all of those things kind of came together. And so when the governor put together the Blue Ribbon Task Force, that was something that the Board of Ed was very, very pleased that there was going to be some movement in that area, because all of the people on that board have a background or at least a very strong interest in education and the future of education as it related to our South Dakota students.
Sounds like you've all been grappling with a lot of the issues that we've been hearing nationally, that there actually isn't a teacher shortage, that when they exist, they're heterogeneous. They differ in terms of, the topic areas, the content areas, and then they differ geographically as well. So one of the challenges that I think just from using the term teacher shortage, it automatically places the blame, so to speak, on the supply side, right? That there's not enough teachers coming in, and that's where the problem is. But we also know that there's demand side problems as well, right? You may have an ample supply of teachers, you might have enough applicants to a program, but if the schools have bureaucratic constraints, right, they're pushed into hiring very, very late, then those applicants may evaporate. If they don't have the skills that they need to identify the right candidates, you're not getting the right people into the position. We get to this idea there's a quality shortage as well, or potentially. How have you guys thought about that dynamic and that the supply and the demand side that are contributing to these staffing challenges?
In relationship to data, that was part of the task that we tackled with the Blue Ribbon Task Force. And you're absolutely right, Peter, that it's so difficult because it is deep, multifaceted. And so we had to make some assumptions in order to stay in a proper lane to try to even get any policy work done. And one of the assumptions was that if a teacher is coming out of a preparation program to become an educator, that program has adequately prepared them. So we were not going to go down that rabbit hole of saying we've got to change the whole academic sector. So what are your options? They're consolidation or moving in the area of efficiency. And so when we started to look at that placement of how do you get benchmark education to the smallest corners of South Dakota, knowing that those schools matter to those communities, we then started to really tackle virtual options and starting to look at how could we fund and meaningfully transform virtual education. So rethinking that perhaps some schools will only have generalist teachers in English, math, science. Maybe you only have 4 or 5 teachers in a K through 12 that's 150 students. And the other educators are brought in virtually. And that has led us to think about paraprofessional development, educating people to hold the decorum of the classroom, people that would be there to coach, help, and support the students in the classroom, but not necessarily a certified teacher for that role.
We have many of those 151 school districts that Senator Soholt talked about that are very small, they're very rural. And no matter what we do, and even though we addressed the issue of pay in the state of South Dakota, there is not a lot of incentive for oftentimes young people to go into those districts. So pay is just one small piece of the puzzle that we knew we needed to address because of the 51st that we were in the nation in teacher pay. But the bigger conversation was really around looking at efficiencies, ways in which we can make our school system more relevant to a 21st century type of learning. And in doing so, funding other avenues of ways that we can make that happen. And so that is a really important component, I think, when we start to look at trying to attract young people into the field. That needs to be done by having an environment in which they see that it's not just the traditional type of system.
So I really want to hit on, make sure we get to spend some time thinking about this innovative approach that you've taken, because your approach to the teacher shortage, I think, would be appreciated, understanding how that came about and how it might be replicated in other states. It's a novel approach, both in terms of what you actually did, but also how you funded it. So could you give us a little background on that?
Yeah, again, as we look back at the issue of trying to fill all the spots across the state, I give this example many times. I know of probably one of the best physics teachers within the entire state of South Dakota, but he's in a tiny, tiny little school district, and he touches about 12 kids per year in his physics class. And it just seems like we should be able to use his expertise and expand that in ways beyond just that one small school of those kids who get to take advantage of that. So taking that concept and really having some forward-thinking individuals on those task force that we were talking about is doing two things. It's addressing the quality issue that we continue to hear about, that the teachers who are coming out maybe aren't prepared in the content areas. It's also addressing the issue that if we can't find teachers in those specific areas, what can we do about that? Because no longer do we really need every single teacher to be a content expert. And so with that in mind, there was a companion bill that we carried that I think is just as important as the bills that talked about increasing taxes and increasing teacher pay and changing the formula, that addressed exactly those things. And one was to expand opportunities for technology use across the state. We are one of the, we are the best wired state. I would like to brag probably in the nation in that we've handled all of our technology in one. Our state manages the technology services for internet, email services, and all of that is paid for and taken care of and provided to all school districts, including their bandwidth, et cetera. So we have the infrastructure well developed. A second piece of that legislation was to incentivize the sharing of services, whether it's sharing teachers, sharing ways in which they can have opportunities to use different ways in which they're training teachers, et cetera. So there were shared service grants that we put out that supported that as well. A third piece was for innovation grants that went out to districts. So when we're talking about this model of providing education in a much different way, it does require that we provide training to teachers in a different way about what does it look like in a classroom where teachers are facilitators of learning rather than always being the actual direct instruction, but getting teachers into the field that might be able to look at providing education in a more relevant, meaningful way for kids.
Kelly, could you help us understand a little bit more about how this money is going to be used?
Well, I think it was interesting. I've been involved in education for over 30 years, and as has Dr. Schopp. But the interesting thing was I saw more signing bonuses for new teachers in South Dakota this year. I felt a little bit like it was the NFL draft. If you were a hot content area teacher, science, math, the signing bonuses were just really, really appealing. And I think maybe outside of the policy, what all of this work has come together and done is really raised an awareness about the profession of teaching. And so as more emphasis has been on that and young people are hearing about higher salaries, we've had a big uptick, at least in my university, in the number of young people that want to go into education. We were really pleasantly surprised at the numbers. And so I think that one of the things that has really come out of this is this conversation back in small towns in South Dakota, large cities in South Dakota, about education itself, about how important it is to our state's economy and to the future of our state for us to have strong, well-educated teachers working with our K-12 students. And the energy around that has been really positive. And I think young people are starting to pick up on that. And the increase that we've had in people really interested in going into education has been marvelous. Dr. Schopp also talked about some additional money that was able to come into play for a distance delivery system that we have. And she mentioned the great physics teacher in South Dakota that maybe only gets to touch 12 students a day. The e-learning center that we have in South Dakota that is able to have master teachers deliver content instruction to students across the state was able to be increased through some funding. They were able to increase and double probably the number of teachers that they have that are able to serve some of the rural schools. And so we have master teachers now that are able to deliver the content in their specific content area to hundreds of students rather than being that one physics teacher that maybe only gets to have one class period a day with 12 students. So additionally, that's kind of come from some work that's been done by policymakers such as Sen Deb Solholt, and it's been really, really appreciated by the small rural schools that didn't have content people in some of those especially advanced upper level areas.
Senator Soholt, Dr. Duncan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.